changes the whole dynamic. One of the biggest stumbling blocks to people, which is shouldn't be any surprise now, is because it was one of the biggest stumbling blocks to the Jewish people when Jesus came, is their concept of what the law of God is. Right?
Yeah.
Because they all thought the law of God was this, but it's that.
Right.
And they missed God and what God was doing and saying because they thought it was this. And I think in the Christian church today, we have the same thing all over again.
Right.
They don't understand what the law of God is.
Right.
And you actually find the human heart when it's confronted with this is the law of God, unless they're like in abject rebellion, like just purposeful rebellion,
Mm-hmm.
their heart will actually wants to gravitate to the law of God. It's just they don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And so if they actually ever heard what the law of God was, they'd find their heart gravitating towards that.
Absolutely.
That's one of the reasons why I've spent so many messages preaching about that. Jesus, I mean, I've said it a million times, but John's gospel reveals Jesus as the law of God. Mm-hmm. It starts with, in the beginning was the Word, the logic, the teaching and instruction of God. What does Psalm 119 talk about the law of God as? The Word of God.
Yeah.
That's what it talks about, the Word of God. So John now comes and he's talking about the law of God, the commandment of God, the logic of God, and he says that thing that we're talking about, the law, the logic, the commandment of God, the Word of God, that thing became flesh and stood before us. And that thing is not full of the law of Moses, it's full of grace and truth.
Yes.
And then he draws a distinction. He says, for the law of Moses, for the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. So he's drawn a distinction between our thoughts of the law of Moses and our thoughts of the Word of God. Yeah. Because most people think the law of Moses is the Word of God.
Absolutely.
In the sense of, this is what you need to do to be justified.
Yeah.
It's not the Word of God in that sense.
Yeah.
It's the Word of God in the sense of, you can't be justified through the strength of your flesh. That's the Word of God that's being declared in the law of Moses. Mm-hmm. You can't be justified by performing this, guys. That's the Word of God declared there. Not, this is how you'll find life. This is what you need to do to be acceptable. This is what you need to do to be justified. It's actually declaring you're in bondage to sin and death because you're trying to be justified through your flesh. Mm-hmm. And then the sacrifice is there, him telling us how he's going to die away our death and set us free from that system.
Right. Yeah, we miss that completely. I mean, we don't, but Christianity in general now misses that.
Because we still don't understand. The whole ministry of Jesus is he comes and reveals himself as the law of God. He writes on the cobblestone.
Yeah.
Moses says such. Now, who gave the law? Moses. So what are those Pharisees saying? The law says this. Who is Jesus? He's the Word that John was talking about that became flesh. So what does Jesus do when they say that? He gets down on the stones in the middle of the temple. Now imagine these big 50-foot high candles, torches in the corner of the temple, all flashing light because they're celebrating the Torah or the law of God. That's what would have been going on then. So Jesus gets down, writes on the stones. Now, the law of Moses was written by the finger of God, it says.
Yes.
And so Jesus gets down and he's giving them a symbol that he is God. And by his finger, he wrote the law of Moses, and he came to declare to them that he is the law of God.
Yes.
That's why he stood up and said, I am the light of the world.
Right.
The Jewish guys thought the law of Moses or the Ten Commandments was the light of the world. Jesus comes on the day they're celebrating the Ten Commandments and the law of Moses. He comes and says, I am the light of God. Now, in saying that, he's saying, I'm the commandment of God. Mm-hmm. I'm the law of God. I'm the teaching and instruction of God. I'm the Word of God. That's what he's declaring when he says that. And he come declaring that to the whole world, so that the whole world would move from looking at the law of Moses and think that that was the law of God, and then they would begin looking upon the Word that was made flesh in Jesus as the law of God. Mm-hmm. Because when we begin looking on Jesus as the law of God, what happens is we become animated with grace.
Yes.
Because that's what Jesus came full of. A truth that can fill us full of grace. Mm-hmm. The law of Moses can't fill you full of grace. The law of Moses ministers death to you.
That's right.
Condemnation. Do you know what the law that's in Jesus ministers to you? Grace. Grace. It ministers grace to you. What did it minister to that woman? Grace.
Grace.
That was caught in adultery. It ministered grace to her. What did that grace do? Conquered her death.
Yes.
Conquered condemnation. Removed the accusation. Sent her sin and her death away from her. That's what the law of God does.
Yeah.
The law of God comes to conquer sin and death.
Yeah, not to impute it.
Right.
Yeah.